Let's talk about this sword of inevitability that I think hangs over history. I find it very fascinating. In German history, there's the Sonderweg theory, the special path that implies that the rise of Nazi Germany or the Third Reich or Hitler was a consequence. It was an inevitability because of the path that Germany was on after World War One, because of the political instability, the economic hardship, the Treaty of Versailles, failures of the Weimar Republic, leaving the country more vulnerable to authoritarianism and nationalism. So, if not Hitler, then someone just like him would have risen to power. He was not a bug of the system, he was a feature of it. That's where I guess the forces of nature were heading. This is a very Marxist view of history, right? Historical materialism. That it's not one person or one event that influences history, it's the forces of nature. And similarly in other countries as well, where you see a rise in authoritarianism or nationalism, if you study the rise of Donald Trump or Modi, just to say that they came out of the blue is to ignore the context that caused their rise to power, right? So how do you view this sort of inevitability? Is history shaped by just great men and great events, is like the great man theory put forward by Thomas Carlyle? Or as disputed by Plekhanov in his essay, The Role of the Individual in History? No, it's not one person or one individual. They're just byproducts of larger movements that shape
It's
history.
both. Obviously, it's both. And a good historian investigates both. Both the larger structural forces that shape a society in a certain way and the critical intervention for good and for bad. There's Gandhi and there's Hitler. The critical intervention for good and for bad by particular individuals who have the power to shape the course. So it's both. But on this question of the long historical forces, let me answer, though I'm something you raised in your earlier question about partition. Was partition inevitable? Now, if you look at the debate today, it's highly polarized. Gandhi could have stopped partition, Nehru could have stopped partition, Patel could have stopped partition, etc., etc. Jinnah was greedy and wanted partition. Right. Now, and this whole debate about why partition happened, could it have been prevented, is all focused on the period 1946-1947. That's it. Right. But actually, the origins of partition lie in the first decade of the 20th century, long before Gandhi and Nehru and Patel entered and Jinnah entered politics. In 1906, so just to give you a sense of how these deeper historical forces influence something like partition, I'll give you a slightly long answer but partition is something which Indians and Pakistanis are obsessed with and keep on endlessly debating, and there are many simplistic, superficial theories offered about it. Right now, in 1857, there was this major rebellion against the British. Right now. That also is, the British called it a mutiny. Savarkar called it the first war of Indian independence. It was more than a mutiny and less than a war of independence. It was a great rebellion. But after that great rebellion, the British imperial state took over the reins of authority from the East India Company, and we formally became a colony of the British Crown, and Queen Victoria became an emperor, and then there was a rather elaborate state structure erected. Now, and in 1857, this is something interesting which I don't think very few of your listeners will have grasped the significance of this. They all know of 1857 because it was the year of the Great Rebellion that was crushed eventually by the East India Company. But 1857 was also the year that the first modern universities came to India. So Calcutta, Bombay and Madras were the first modern universities were established in 1857. The Great Rebellion was looking backwards to the Mughal Raj, to the Mughal Empire, to the resurrection and the recreation of the Mughal Empire. The universities of 1857 were looking forward to a transforming society, and ideas of freedom and justice and equality came inadvertently there because the British wanted modern education to train babus for their civil service. But by now, Britain had become a democracy, and liberal thinkers were arguing for rights for women and equality and so on. All that came to the universities. And through the second half of the 19th century, Hindus took much more to modern education than the Muslims. Some Muslims did. I mean, Sayyid Ahmad Khan who was a great Muslim reformer, warned the Muslims not to wallow in nostalgia for the Mughal Empire, as the leaders of 1857 were doing. Remember, in 1857, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal, was held up as the great ruler of India. He said, don't wallow in nostalgia. And he started the Aligarh Muslim University. But most Muslims were wallowing in nostalgia. And from 1857 to 1900, Hindus took a dramatic lead over Muslims in modern education, access to modern jobs. There were many more Hindu lawyers, professors, doctors, civil servants, industrialists, and so on and so forth, right? Because modern industry was also starting. So in 1906, sensing this asymmetry, a group of Muslim nobles and aristocrats started the Muslim League. And they appealed to the British, because the British had now started conceding some limited representation in councils. So there were town councils, legislative councils, where the British were still ruling, but Indians had some kind of voice. They said in these local small-scale elections, for which educated Indians could vote and become elected as members, in this, there should be a separate electorate for Muslims. And the British conceded that demand, partly because they wanted to divide Hindus and Muslims. Because 1905 is also the year, 1905 is the year, 1905, 1906 are the years of the Swadeshi movement and a vigorous upsurge of the Congress. So that's what happened. So the creation of separate electorates, the formation of the Muslim League in 1906, and the creation of separate electorates, where Muslims vote for Muslims and Muslims represent Muslims, sows the seed of partition. Because the Hindus are also want to organize politically. So from 1906, partition becomes likely. Not inevitable, but likely. In 1937, elections are held for the first limited self-government comes in 1937, when under the Government of India Act of 1935, which is a result of the nationalist pressure of the Congress and so on, you have elections in 9 provinces. The Congress comes to power in 7. In 1946, after the war, elections are held again, and the Muslim League sweeps the Muslim seats. So now a Muslim nation becomes inevitable, because there's a groundswell of intellectual Muslim opinion behind Jinnah. So the only question is, how will partition occur? Slowly, incrementally, with safeguards in place to minimize violence. But by 1946, and arguably by 1937, and possibly even by 1930, and perhaps even by 1909, when you have separate electorates, the seeds of partition are sown. So these are these deeper structural forces where, as a consequence of what happens after the 1857 rebellion, Muslims fall behind in education and employment, and there's a move to give them separate representation, and that really leads to politics being conducted on religious lines. So in a sense, this is how, and of course, it's possible that if in 1937, 38, when Jinnah and Gandhi had talks, if these two individuals had worked out a compact, maybe it could have been averted. We don't know, right? But this whole story of the long roots of partition shows the complex interaction between deeper historical forces and individual the trajectories and whims and fancies and preferences of individuals. And so both are important. I mean, I think the Marxists, the idea that individuals don't matter, even the Marxists rejected in the case of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. They think, I think those three.
Yeah,
I mean, which they did, of course. Which they did. So I think it's the interplay between institutions and individuals, between what historians call structure and agency, that varies across different, So even in the case of Gandhi, to go back to Gandhi, now, you can see if Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, January, in February his mentor Gokhale dies. If Gokhale had stayed alive, Gokhale was a nationalist, but a liberal Democrat who opposed Satyagraha. He would have told Gandhi, don't do Satyagraha.
Right.
But Gokhale is dead in 1915. In 1919, Gandhi launches his first Satyagraha, major All India Satyagraha against the Rolett Act. While he is launching it, the most popular militant nationalist leader, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, is away in England fighting a court case. So Gandhi emerges as the leader, Tilak comes back and dies. So the space is wholly Gandhi's. So clearly, the death, the arrival of individuals, of accidental circumstances shape what happens. But the larger forces do too. And a good historian in their account of what had happened in the past would really adjust for both, properly adjust for both.